Commander stood before the holographic display, his four arms crossed in what his species considered a gesture of confidence. The blue light from the projection illuminated his scaled features as he studied the primitive planet rotating slowly before him. Earth, the locals called it, a backwater world in an unremarkable star system, inhabited by a species that had barely managed to crawl beyond their own atmosphere. "This is almost insulting," said from her position beside him. His second-in-command was a veteran of 200 campaigns, and she had never hidden her opinions. 40 operatives for this. We could handle it with 10. His mandibles clicked in amusement. The client is paying for certainty, not economy. Besides, when has overwhelming force ever been a mistake? The consortium had built its reputation over 3,000 years of successful operations across 17 dimensions. Governments hired them when diplomacy failed. Corporations hired them when competitors needed removing. Entities that existed beyond normal space hired them when reality itself needed adjusting. In all that time, across all those dimensions, they had never failed to complete a contract. This job should have been simple. The Commerce Guild wanted humanity's solar system for its mineral deposits. The rare elements buried in Earth's crust and scattered through its asteroid belt were worth more than most civilizations could earn in a century. The humans themselves were the only obstacle, and they were barely worth considering as one. Had reviewed the intelligence reports 3 times, looking for hidden dangers. There were none. Humanity's most advanced weapons were chemical rockets and nuclear warheads. They had no dimensional technology. Their fastest ships crawled between planets at speeds that would take months to cross distances that could traverse in seconds. Their military organizations were fragmented across hundreds of competing nation-states, each more concerned with their neighbors than with threats from beyond their sky. "Standard extraction protocol," announced to his assembled team. Phase 1, we eliminate their command and control infrastructure. Phase 2, we deploy atmospheric processors. Phase 3, cleanup and verification. 72 hours from breach to completion. The 40 operatives arrayed before him represented the best the consortium could offer. Each had survived dozens of combat drops across hostile worlds. They wore armor that could withstand anything short of a direct hit from a plasma cannon. Their weapons could slice through reinforced steel like it was paper. Their training had been purchased with the blood of 1,000 failed recruits. "Intel shows their detection capabilities are essentially non-existent," added, pulling up additional displays. "They have some radio telescopes pointed at the sky, but they're looking for natural phenomena, not dimensional breaches. We'll be on them before they know we've arrived." Studied the faces of his team. Some showed eagerness, others showed boredom. None showed concern. Why would they? This was a Tier 9 civilization. The regularly took contracts against Tier 5s and 6s. The gap in capability was so vast that calling it a fight seemed generous. Questions asked. A younger operative raised one hand. "Rules of engagement, sir." "Standard. Minimize collateral damage to infrastructure and natural resources. Human casualties are acceptable as necessary to complete the objective. The client wants the system intact and empty." The operative nodded and lowered his hand. Around the briefing room, equipment checks continued. Weapons hummed as power cells were tested. Armor seals hissed as they were. Dimensional breach generators spun up with a sound like reality clearing its throat. Had conducted this ritual hundreds of times. The preparation, the planning, the moment before insertion when everything hung in perfect balance. He loved this part, the certainty of it. The knowledge that his team would perform exactly as trained, that the enemy would respond exactly as predicted, and that in 72 hours he would be filing another successful completion report. "Breach in 30 minutes, the operations officer announced. "Target zone is the Pacific Ocean, 100 kilometers west of the North American continent. Time on target is 0300 local, optimal for catching their military infrastructure at minimal readiness. Moved closer too, lowering her voice. Do you ever wonder if we're the villains in these operations? Mandibles clicked again, but this time without amusement. We're professionals that have a legitimate claim to unclaimed space. The humans just happen to be in the way. They don't see it as unclaimed. They don't have the capability to enforce their claim, gestured at the display. Look at them, they're children playing at civilization. We're doing them a favor, really, quick and clean. They'll never see us coming. His second-in-command didn't look convinced, but she nodded and returned to her equipment checks, understood her discomfort. Every soldier eventually questioned the nature of their work. He'd gone through it himself 2 centuries ago. The answer he'd found was simple. The universe didn't run on morality, it ran on capability. The strong thrived, the weak adapted or perished. Humanity had failed to develop the strength to hold their territory. That was their failure, not his. The 30 minutes passed quickly. His team assembled in the breach chamber, a circular room 500 meters across. At its center, the dimensional generator pulsed with barely contained energy. The air itself seemed to bend around it, creating distortions that hurt to look at directly. All teams sound off, commanded. One by one, the team leaders reported their readiness. Weapons hot, armor sealed, breach coordinates locked. Everything was perfect, exactly as it should be. Commence breach in 10 seconds, the operations officer said. 9, 8, 7. Felt his pulse quicken despite his experience. This moment never got old. The moment when reality itself bent to their will, when the impossible became routine. 3, 2, 1, breach. The generator screamed. Space folded. Dimensions that were never meant to touch collided and merged. The team stepped forward into a tunnel that existed in no single reality, a passage carved through the fabric of existence itself. Emerged into darkness and salt spray. The Pacific Ocean stretched around them, illuminated only by starlight and the faint glow of distant cities on the horizon. His armor's sensors immediately began cataloging the environment. Atmosphere compatible, temperature within tolerance. No immediate threats detected. Phase 1 teams move to your targets, ordered. Phase 2 begin processor deployment. Maintain communication protocols. The team dispersed with practiced efficiency. Some vanished back through smaller dimensional tiers, heading for their assigned military installations. Others activated flight systems and streaked toward the coastlines. A group of specialists began assembling the atmospheric processors that would make Earth uninhabitable for humanity while preserving its value for the. Watched them go, satisfaction warming his chest. Another operation beginning exactly as planned. In 72 hours, this would all be over. The consortium would collect their payment. They would have their mining rights. Humanity would be a footnote in the records, another primitive species that failed to adapt quickly enough. His armor's alert system chimed softly, then it chimed again, then it began screaming. Every sensor on every suit registered the same thing simultaneously. Detection. They had been detected, not by crude radio telescopes or primitive radar, but by something that recognized dimensional breach signatures. Sir's voice crackled over the communication channel. Are you seeing this? Confirmed sensor readings, snapped, his confidence cracking. Confirmed, sir, they knew, they were waiting. Across the planet's surface, lights began appearing. Not the scattered lights of cities going about their peaceful business, but coordinated patterns. Military installations coming online. Defense grids activating. Alert systems spreading like wildfire across every continent. Mandibles went rigid. In 3,000 years, across 17 dimensions, this had never happened. The primitives had been ready. Somehow, impossibly, the humans had been expecting them. All teams, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Weapons free, execute Phase 1. Around the planet, the consortium's finest operatives moved to attack. They had overwhelming technological superiority. They had perfect training. They had never failed. But in that moment, watching humanity's response spread across his displays like a living thing, Commander felt something he hadn't experienced in 200 years of combat. He felt doubt. The operation was 3 minutes old and already nothing was going according to plan. Push the feeling down. They were professionals. They would adapt. They would overcome. They always did. The alert reached General Sarah's command center exactly 3.7 seconds after the dimensional breach occurred. She was already moving before her staff had finished processing what the sensors were telling them. All stations, this is command. Execute Protocol Lighthouse. This is not a drill. Protocol Lighthouse. They had practiced it 200 times in the 3 years since the refugees had arrived, since humanity learned they weren't alone in the universe, since they discovered that the cosmos was far more crowded and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Across the planet, military forces that had spent decades preparing to fight each other pivoted to face an enemy from beyond their dimension. Ancient rivalries were set aside. Political differences became irrelevant. Humanity had known this day might come, and they had decided together that whatever else divided them, they would face the unknown as one species. Screens lit up with incoming reports. 43-dimensional signatures detected. Analysis suggested combat team composition. Primary breach point in the Pacific. Secondary tiers opening near major military installations on 4 continents. They're going for command and control, her operations officer said. Classic decapitation strike. Good luck with that, muttered. She pressed the transmit key. All decoy installations full activation. Make them think they're hitting real targets. Humanity had learned many things from the refugees who had fled the dimensional empires. One lesson had been particularly valuable. Never keep all your important things in obvious places. Every major military base that showed up on satellite imagery was now either a decoy or a hardened fortress designed to survive initial strikes. The real command infrastructure was scattered through bunkers buried under mountains, mobile installations constantly moving across the oceans, and networks distributed through so many nodes that destroying any single point accomplished nothing. Reports began flooding in from the decoy sites. The attackers were good. They hit fast and hard, with weapons that turned reinforced concrete into dust, but they were hitting empty buildings and automated systems, wasting their element of surprise on ghosts. First contact in Colorado, a communications officer announced. Aerospace Defense reports engaging one enemy squad. Pulled up the feed. She watched through the helmet camera of an F-35 pilot as the impossible unfolded. Armored figures hovering in midair, weapons that cut through aircraft like they were made of paper, movements too fast for human reflexes to track. But the pilot didn't try to track them. She didn't try to engage in a dogfight she couldn't win. She identified the target, calculated the angle, and drove her dying aircraft straight into the transport craft that had deployed the squad. Both exploded in a fireball visible for 50 miles. Jesus Christ, someone whispered in the command center. Get me her squadron commander, said quietly. I want her family contacted immediately, full honors. The war was minutes old, and humanity had already paid in blood. It wouldn't be the last sacrifice. Had known that when she helped design Protocol Lighthouse. They all had known. The refugees had been clear about what the dimensional empires were capable of. But the refugees had also told them something else. Something that had seemed like madness at the time but now felt like prophecy. Humanity fought differently than any other species they had encountered. Where others optimized for efficiency and survival, humans were willing to trade everything for victory. Where others saw acceptable losses as a mathematical equation, humans saw each death as a reason to fight harder. Enemy squad grounded in Colorado, the operations officer reported. Ground forces moving to engage. Tell them the rules of engagement, said. Maximum effectiveness, minimum necessary force. If they surrender, we take prisoners. If they're wounded, we treat them. Her staff looked at her like she was insane. They were being invaded by creatures from another dimension, and she wanted to play by civilized rules. Do it, said firmly. We're fighting to survive, but we're also fighting to prove who we are. Every decision we make now will echo for generations, maybe longer. More reports cascaded in. Enemy teams scattered across the globe. Some hitting decoys, some hitting real installations. Casualties mounting on both sides. Nuclear powers requesting permission to launch strategic weapons at the primary breach point. Took a breath. The weapons would work. The dimensional breach was a massive distortion in spacetime. Nuclear weapons would destabilize it, maybe collapse it entirely. But the fallout would poison the Pacific for decades. The environmental damage would be catastrophic. Permission granted, she said. Target the breach point only, minimum necessary yield. Because that was the calculation humanity had made. They would accept damage to themselves, would sacrifice their own safety, would pay any price to defend their home. But they would try, even in the middle of an existential war, to minimize the long-term harm. It was probably stupid. It was definitely inefficient, but it was human. Ma'am, the intelligence officer said, we're getting strange readings from the enemy teams. They're hesitating. Explain. They're encountering heavier resistance than expected. Their tactical models aren't accounting for our willingness to accept casualties. One team broke off an assault because we crashed 4 jets into their position. They classified it as a suicide attack and retreated to reassess. Felt a cold smile touch her lips. They think we're crazy. Yes, ma'am. Their communications intercepts suggest they've never encountered an enemy that fights like this. Good, said. Let them think we're crazy. Let them think we're unpredictable. Let them think that every human they meet might be willing to die to stop them. Because it was true. Not all humans, maybe not even most humans, but enough. Enough pilots who would crash their planes. Enough soldiers who would hold impossible positions. Enough people who would look at beings from another dimension and decide that some lines couldn't be crossed, regardless of the cost. Nuclear launch in 30 seconds, weapons control reported. Watch the countdown. 30 seconds until humanity threw its most destructive weapons at an enemy they barely understood. 30 seconds until they proved they were willing to damage their own world to protect it. The missiles launched from submarines hidden in the ocean depths. They streaked toward the dimensional breach, carrying warheads designed to end civilizations. The consortium had expected to face primitives with barely controllable weapons. They were about to learn that sometimes the primitive solution was also the correct one. Impact in 15 seconds, weapons control said. 10 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Pacific Ocean lit up like a new sun. The dimensional breach, that tier in reality itself, destabilized under the assault of nuclear fire. Energy from 2 dimensions met and fought and annihilated each other in a blast that registered on sensors around the globe. Breach closing, sensors reported. Dimensional signature collapsing. Didn't celebrate. The breach was closing, but 43 enemy operatives were still scattered across the planet. They were cut off from reinforcements, but they were still the most dangerous combatants humanity had ever faced. All forces switched to containment protocol, ordered. Hunt them down, but remember the rules of engagement. We fight to win, but we fight as humans. Around the planet, the battle continued, but the invaders had lost their certainty. They had come expecting an easy operation against primitives. Instead, they had found an enemy that fought with a desperation and creativity they had never encountered before. In his command suit hovering over the Pacific, Commander watched his dimensional breach collapse and finally understood what he had gotten his team into. These weren't primitives. These were something far more dangerous. These were survivors. Commander crouched in the ruins of what had once been a warehouse on the outskirts of Denver. His armor was damaged. 2 of his 4 arms were barely functional, and he had lost contact with 17 of his 40 operatives. The mission that should have taken 72 hours had turned into a nightmare in less than 48. Status, he demanded over the local communication channel. His voice came back, strained and exhausted. My squad is down to 4. We're pinned in a canyon 20 miles from your position. The humans have artillery. Artillery. They're dropping chemical explosives on us like it's still their industrial age. And it's working, another voice added. It was one of the squad leaders who had been tasked with securing the North American command infrastructure. They're not trying to match our technology. They're using what they have effectively. His mandibles ground together in frustration. His armor's displays showed tactical analyses scrolling past, each one more dire than the last. They had better weapons, better armor, better training. But humanity had numbers, knowledge of the terrain, and something the analysts were calling adaptive tactical evolution. The humans were learning from every engagement, spreading that knowledge across their forces in real time, and changing their approach faster than any species they had ever fought. Sir, I have wounded, said 3 of my squad. They need medical attention within the hour or they'll die. Felt his chest tighten. Standard protocol said to leave wounded behind if they couldn't be evacuated. The mission always came first. But what mission? The dimensional breach was closed. The atmospheric processors had been destroyed. Half his team was dead or missing. There was no mission anymore, just survival. Find defensible cover, ordered. Transmit your coordinates on the emergency band. We'll attempt extraction after nightfall. Sir, the emergency band is monitored. The humans will hear it. I know. He didn't say the rest. He didn't say that he was hoping the humans would hear it. Didn't say that in the last 2 days he had seen something that disturbed him more than any weapon or tactic. The humans took prisoners. They treated wounded. They fought with a ferocity that should have come from mindless savages, but they did it while following rules, while maintaining discipline, while still trying to act like civilized beings in the middle of a war for their survival. It made no sense. It was tactically inefficient. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. All teams, said, making a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 days ago. Cease offensive operations. Fall back to defensible positions. Prepare for extraction negotiations. Sir, said carefully, are you suggesting we surrender? I'm suggesting we stop dying for a contract we can't complete. Pulled up the holographic display that showed the positions of his remaining teams. Red dots scattered across a continent, surrounded by thousands of blue dots representing human military forces. We're not going to win this. We need to get our people home. The communications channel went silent. In 3,000 years, the consortium had never surrendered, never even considered it. They were the predators, the unstoppable force, the inevitable end to any resistance. But they had never fought humanity before. Movement, one of nearby operatives said suddenly. Multiple contacts approaching our position. Checked his sensors. 20 human soldiers approaching in a careful tactical formation, not attacking, not charging, but advancing with their weapons ready. His hand moved to his sidearm, but he stopped. Hold fire, he ordered. Let's see what they want. The humans stopped 50 meters away. One of them stepped forward, arms raised to show he was unarmed. He was wearing combat gear covered in dust and what looked like blood. His face was young, but his eyes were old. Commander, the human called out in badly accented but comprehensible trade language. I am Lieutenant United States Army. I'm authorized to negotiate terms. Stood, his damaged armor whining in protest. He walked to the edge of the warehouse where he could see the human clearly. You speak our language. We had good teachers, said. Refugees from your dimensional wars. They taught us a lot in 3 years, including that most honor professional courtesy when it's offered. You killed 17 of my operatives. You tried to exterminate our entire species, replied without anger. We're at war. People die in wars, but wars can end. Studied the young human. Behind him, the other 19 soldiers waited with disciplined patience. They could have attacked. With his armor damaged and his squad scattered, they probably would have won. But they had chosen to talk instead. What are your terms? Asked. Cease fire, you call off your scattered teams, we stop hunting them. Your wounded get medical treatment. Then we negotiate. Negotiate what? My breach is closed. I have no extraction capability. Smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. We learned how to detect dimensional breaches. You think we didn't learn how to create them? We can send you home, Commander, all of you, the ones who are still alive. Felt something cold settle in his gut. The humans could open dimensional breaches. In 3 years, they had gone from not knowing other dimensions existed to being able to tear holes in reality. The implications were staggering. Why would you send us home? Asked. Why not execute us as invaders? Because we're not trying to win a war, said. We're trying to survive contact with the greater universe. That means showing the dimensional empires what humanity is, what we value, how we fight, and how we make peace. You're trying to establish precedent. We're trying to establish that we're people, not primitives to be exterminated for convenience. Lowered his hands. You came here thinking we were nothing, that we couldn't stop you. You were wrong, but you don't have to die being wrong. Take the deal, Commander. Get your people home. Tell the consortium what you found here. Looked at the ruined warehouse, at his battered armor, at the human soldiers waiting patiently for his decision. He thought about, and her wounded squad members, about the 17 dead operatives whose families would never know how they died, about the fact that he had led the consortium's finest into a meat grinder against an enemy that shouldn't have been able to fight back. I accept your terms, said, under professional courtesy protocols. Nodded and spoke into his radio. Within minutes, vehicles were arriving. Human medics began setting up aid stations, transmitted orders to his scattered teams, ordering them to cease fire and coordinate with local human forces. It felt like defeat. It tasted like failure. But as he watched human doctors treating wounded operatives with the same care they showed their own soldiers, realized something profound. Humanity hadn't just defeated the in battle. They had defeated the entire premise of the invasion. They had proven that they weren't primitives to be brushed aside. They were people who would fight with everything they had, sacrifice whatever was necessary, but still try to act with honor and compassion even toward enemies who had shown them none. Your wounded will be ready to travel in 6 hours, said, returning to where stood. We'll have a dimensional breach ready by then. How long have you been able to create breaches? Asked. This will be our first one, admitted, but we're pretty confident. We had good teachers, remember. The audacity of it struck like a physical blow. The humans were going to attempt their first-ever dimensional breach to send their enemies home. If it failed, it could kill everyone within miles. And they were doing it anyway because they had promised. You're insane, said quietly. Smile returned. We prefer to think of ourselves as optimistic. He paused. Commander, when you get home, when you report to your consortium, tell them something for us. What? Tell them we're here. Tell them we're not going away. Tell them we'll defend ourselves against any threat, but also tell them we're willing to talk, to trade, to coexist. His expression hardened. And tell them that if they try this again, we won't be as merciful next time. We know about dimensional technology now. We'll be ready. His mandibles clicked in what might have been respect. They won't believe me. Then show them the footage. Show them how we fight. Let them decide if we're worth the cost of another invasion. Over the next 6 hours, watched as humanity organized his extraction. His scattered teams were brought together, treated for their injuries and prepared for transit. The humans worked with brisk efficiency, but also with something else: compassion. They gave food to hungry operatives. They answered questions about Earth and human culture. They treated the not as defeated enemies but as fellow soldiers who had simply been on the wrong side of a conflict. When the dimensional breach opened, the first one humanity had ever created, crackling with barely controlled energy, led his 36 surviving operatives through it. As he stepped back into his own dimension, he looked back at the humans one last time. Lieutenant raised one hand in what recognized as a gesture of farewell, returned it, then stepped through and let the breach close behind him. The board meeting of the consortium was the most contentious in its 3,000-year history. Stood in the center of the chamber, while holographic displays showed footage from the Earth operation. His superiors watched in silence as human pilots crashed aircraft into positions, as artillery strikes destroyed supposedly invincible armor, as a species that shouldn't have been able to fight back, systematically, dismantled the finest force the consortium could deploy. "This is unprecedented," board director said when the footage ended. "Unacceptable. We cannot allow this failure to stand." "With respect, Director, we have no choice," said. "The Commerce Guild is demanding a second attempt. They're offering triple the original payment, but I'm recommending we refuse the contract." The chamber erupted. Board members shouted over each other, mandibles clicking in outrage, displays flashing with economic models and reputation analyses. The financial loss was significant, but the damage to the consortium's reputation was potentially catastrophic. "Commander," said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "in 3,000 years we have never refused a contract once accepted. The precedent would destroy us." "Completing this contract would destroy us," countered. He pulled up tactical displays, showing human capabilities analyzed from the battle. "Director, in 72 hours humanity went from defensive operations to creating their own dimensional breaches. Their learning curve is nearly vertical. If we mount a second invasion with enough force to guarantee success, we're talking about resources equivalent to conquering a Type 2 civilization." "They're a Tier 9 species," another board member protested. "They were a Tier 9 species," said from her position beside. She was still recovering from her injuries, leaning heavily on a support frame. "They're not anymore. In 3 years they went from not knowing other dimensions existed to being able to manipulate dimensional technology. In 3 more years, where will they be?" The board fell silent. The implications settled over them like a weight. "There's something else," continued. "Something more important than their technology or their tactics." He pulled up footage of human medics treating wounded. "They fight like demons, but they maintain ethical standards even in the middle of existential combat. They took prisoners. They treated wounds. They sent us home when they could have executed us." "Weakness," said dismissively. "I thought so too," admitted. "But it's not weakness. It's strategy. They're showing the dimensional community what humanity is, what they value, and they're betting that other species will respect them for it." He pulled up the final piece of footage. Lieutenant's farewell, his warning about future conflicts, his offer of coexistence alongside his promise of merciless defense. "They're not just fighting to survive," said quietly. "They're fighting to establish themselves as people who matter, as a civilization that deserves a place in the dimensional community. And Director, they're succeeding, because we're standing here debating whether to fight them again, and every single one of us knows the cost would be enormous." Studied the displays for a long moment. "What are you proposing, Commander?" "Blacklist them. Make it official consortium policy that contracts against Earth or human interests are rejected. Not because we can't win, but because the cost-benefit analysis doesn't support it. The other mercenary organizations will see it as weakness." "Let them try," said. "Let them spend their resources and their operatives. When they fail, and they will fail, they'll come around to our position. We can lead the way or we can follow, but the outcome is inevitable. Humanity is ascending to the dimensional stage, and we need to decide if we want to be their enemies or their potential allies. The debate raged for 6 more hours. Economic models were run. Military analyses were presented. The footage from Earth was watched and rewatched. Finally, with 3 dissenting votes, the board made its decision. The consortium would blacklist humanity. Any member organization that took contracts against Earth would be expelled. The official reason was risk management. The unofficial reason spread through the dimensional mercenary networks within days. They were afraid, not of losing a battle, but of fighting an enemy that could beat them while simultaneously trying to understand them, teach them, and establish grounds for future cooperation. An enemy that fought wars while planning for peace. An enemy that would spend years trying to convince you that you had been wrong to fight them in the first place. 3 months after the invasion, Earth's United Defense Council received a communication through the diplomatic channels the refugees had established. It was from the consortium, sent through official channels, stamped with seals that had weight in 17 dimensions. It was an apology and a treaty proposal. General read it 3 times before she believed what she was seeing. They wanted to establish formal relations. They wanted to share information about dimensional threats. They wanted to discuss mutual defense agreements. They wanted to be humanity's allies instead of its enemies. "It's a trick," one of her advisors said. "It has to be." "Maybe," said. "Or maybe they're smart enough to recognize that humanity is going to be a major player in dimensional politics whether they like it or not. Better to get in on the ground floor." She thought about the pilots who had died crashing their aircraft into enemy positions, about the soldiers who had held impossible lines, about the decision to show mercy to defeated enemies, about humanity's choice to fight as fiercely as necessary while still trying to maintain its principles. "Draft a response," ordered. "Tell them we're willing to talk, but make it clear. We're not forgetting what they tried to do. Trust has to be earned." The reply was sent through the dimensional channels. It would take weeks to traverse the distances involved, even with technology that bent reality. But it would arrive, and they would read it, and they would understand. Humanity had arrived on the dimensional stage, not as victims to be exterminated, not as primitives to be ignored, but as people who would fight for their place, who would defend their values, and who would offer cooperation even to those who had tried to destroy them. In mercenary bars across 17 dimensions, the word spread. They had blacklisted humanity. Other organizations were following suit, not because humans were weak, but because they were too strong, too adaptable, too willing to sacrifice, and too likely to turn enemies into friends given enough time. The story became legend. The tale of the mercenaries who invaded Earth expecting an easy payday and found instead an enemy that would redefine what it meant to be a threat. An enemy that would force the entire dimensional community to acknowledge a new truth. Humanity was here, and the universe would never be the same. Commander, retired from active operations and now teaching tactics at the consortium's military academy, ended every class with the same warning. He would pull up the footage from Earth, show his students the battles, the human tactics, the impossible bravery, and the terrifying adaptability. Then he would look at the young operatives and say, "Never underestimate an enemy just because they lack your technology. Never assume primitive means helpless. And never, ever take a contract against humanity. Because even if you win the battle, you'll lose the war. They'll make sure of it." The students would nod, not quite understanding, but they would remember. Everyone remembered Earth. Everyone remembered what humanity had proven in 72 hours of desperate combat, that intelligence and courage and determination could overcome any technological advantage, that a species willing to sacrifice everything for survival could defeat enemies who thought themselves invincible, that sometimes The primitives were more dangerous than anyone expected. And that humanity, once awakened to its place in the cosmos, would never again be underestimated.